Let us journey back together now, to the close of the 11th century. Imagine a world standing at a pivotal crossroads of history, a world lit by the flickering glow of candles and the cold light of distant stars. The great Mediterranean Sea, the heart of the ancient world, was now a fractured mirror, reflecting two different civilizations on its shores. To the north lay the vast, sprawling, and fractious world of Western Christendom, a land of stone castles, feudal loyalties, and a deep, abiding, and often militant Christian faith. To the south and east lay the equally vast and sophisticated world of Islam, a civilization rich with science, poetry, and its own profound faith. For centuries, these two worlds had coexisted in a state of tense and often hostile balance, a quiet struggle of influence and ideology. But this fragile balance was about to be shattered. In the great, ancient city of Constantinople, the mighty eastern half of the old Roman world, the Byzantine Empire, found itself in a perilous position. It was an empire besieged, its territories in Anatolia, the heartland of its strength, being steadily consumed by the advances of the Seljuk Turks. The emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, a shrewd and capable ruler, looked out from the walls of his magnificent city and saw his empire crumbling. Facing these mounting military pressures, he made a fateful decision. He would reach out to his estranged Christian brethren in the West, to the Pope in Rome, and appeal for military assistance, for mercenary soldiers to help him push back the Turkish threat. It was a desperate and pragmatic political calculation, a decision that would trigger consequences far beyond his wildest imagination. At the same time, Europe itself was a land brimming with a restless and volatile energy. The feudal system had created a large and powerful class of land-hungry knights and nobles, a warrior aristocracy whose violent energies, with no great external enemy to fight, were often turned inward, upon each other, in a cycle of petty warfare. And permeating every aspect of daily life was a deep and powerful religious devotion. For many Christians of this age, the highest form of piety was the act of pilgrimage, a long and arduous journey to a sacred site. And no site was more sacred, more central to the medieval Christian imagination, than the holy city of Jerusalem, the city where Christ had lived, died, and been resurrected. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, and while Christian pilgrims had generally been permitted to visit its holy sites, the journey was long, dangerous, and the very idea of the holiest city in Christendom being in the hands of non-believers was a source of deep and abiding spiritual concern. This complex tapestry of religious fervor, political ambition, economic necessity, and cultural misunderstanding formed the backdrop for the events that were to come. The stage was set. All that was needed was a spark. And that spark was lit on a cold November day in the year 1095, in a field in Clermont, France. There, a great council of the Church had been convened, and at its conclusion, Pope Urban II rose to address the assembled multitude of clergy, nobles, and common people. Imagine the scene. A great crowd stands in the open air, their breath misting in the autumn chill. Before them, on a high platform, stands the Pope. And as he begins to speak, his voice, filled with passion and authority, rises over the crowd, and a new, powerful, and dangerous idea is unleashed upon the world. He painted a vivid and harrowing picture of the Christian lands of the East, of churches desecrated, and of fellow Christians suffering under the rule of what he called an accursed race. From the confines of Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople, Urban declared, his voice ringing with emotion, a horrible tale has gone forth, an accursed race has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. Then, he made his extraordinary offer, a theological innovation that would mobilize an entire continent. "Undertake this journey for the remission of your sins," he promised, with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven. It was a staggering promise. For the knight who had lived a life of violence, for the peasant who had toiled in sin, for every man and woman who feared for their eternal soul, the Pope was offering a path to salvation, a plenary indulgence, a complete cleansing of all sins for those who would take up the sword and march to liberate the holy city. As his speech reached its climax, a great emotional wave swept through the crowd. A single cry went up, and then it was taken up by thousands of voices, until the very air seemed to vibrate with the sound. "Deus vult," they cried. "God wills it." This became the rallying cry of the entire crusading movement. In that moment, on that field in France, the First Crusade was born. The Pope's words had ignited a fire in the heart of Europe, a fire that would burn for 2 centuries, a fire that would send tens of thousands on a long and bloody journey to a land most of them had only ever heard of in stories, a fire that would forever change the relationship between the great civilizations of the East and the West. In the months that followed Pope Urban's momentous speech at Clermont, a strange and powerful fever swept across the lands of Europe. The Pope's call to arms, his staggering promise of eternal salvation for those who would march to the Holy Land, resonated not just in the great halls of the nobility, but more powerfully, more immediately, in the hearts of the common people. Before the great dukes and counts could even begin the long and complex process of mortgaging their lands and assembling their armies, the roads of France and Germany began to fill with an extraordinary and unexpected procession. This was not an army in any conventional sense. It was a great, spontaneous, and chaotic migration, a river of humanity overflowing its banks. This was the People's Crusade. At the head of this movement was a charismatic and intense figure, a French monk known as Peter the Hermit. Imagine him now, a small, gaunt man, his feet bare, his face thin and weathered, his eyes burning with a wild, magnetic fire. He rode upon a simple donkey, yet he commanded an authority that kings might envy. He was a powerful preacher, and as he traveled from village to village, his impassioned sermons fanned the flames of the crusading fever into a raging inferno. He spoke of the suffering of their Christian brethren in the East, of the defilement of the holy places, and of the sacred duty of all true Christians to rise up and reclaim the city of Christ. His words were like a spark falling on dry tinder, and everywhere he went, thousands left their fields, their workshops, and their homes to follow him. The crowds that gathered around him were a testament to the profound piety and the deep desperation of the age. There were peasants who had spent their entire lives tied to a small plot of land, their horizons limited to the next harvest and the walls of their lord's castle. For them, the crusade was a chance to escape a life of unrelenting toil, a chance to see the world, and, most importantly, a chance to participate in a great, divine drama that would wash away their sins and guarantee their place in heaven. There were townspeople, artisans and small merchants, who joined the procession, their hearts filled with a simple and powerful faith. And there were even some minor knights, men of little land or fortune, who, lacking the resources to join the great noble contingents, chose instead to throw in their lot with this great popular movement. They were a vast, undisciplined, and profoundly moving collection of souls, united by a shared and fervent belief in the righteousness of their cause. Lacking any real military discipline, adequate supplies, or effective leadership, these early crusaders, these pilgrims of passion, set out for the distant city of Jerusalem in the spring of 1096, months before the organized armies of the princes were prepared to depart. Their journey across Europe quickly became a path of destruction and sorrow. They believed that as soldiers of Christ, they would be provided for, that God himself would feed his army. But the realities of a long march soon set in. Hunger gnawed at their ranks, and their fervent piety often gave way to a desperate lawlessness. As they moved through the Rhineland in Germany, a dark and tragic chapter of this popular movement unfolded. Some of the Crusaders, their religious zeal twisted into a violent fanaticism, concluded that the enemies of Christ could be found much closer to home. They turned their fury upon the ancient and prosperous Jewish communities of the Rhineland cities. It was a terrible and shameful perversion of the crusading ideal, a stark reminder of how easily a call for holy war against an external foe could be turned into a wave of persecution against a vulnerable minority within. When the ragged, starving, and now feared columns of the People's Crusade finally reached the borders of the Byzantine Empire, the Emperor Alexios was alarmed. This was not the disciplined force of elite mercenary knights he had requested. This was a vast, unruly, and unpredictable mob. Fearing that they would cause chaos and strip the countryside of its resources, he hastily had them transported across the Bosphorus Strait, from Europe into Asia Minor, urging them to wait for the arrival of the main Crusader armies. But the pilgrims of passion, their hearts still burning with a desire to be the first to reach the holy city, would not wait. They pushed on into Turkish-held territory. And there, in October of 1096, near the city of Nicaea, their journey came to its swift and disastrous end. The disciplined, professional forces of the Seljuk Turks, masters of the swift cavalry charge and the deadly arrow storm, lured the undisciplined army into a trap. They were annihilated. The great popular movement, which had begun with such fervent hope and religious ecstasy on the fields of France, now lay broken and bleeding on the plains of Anatolia. The People's Crusade was over. It was a tragic overture to the main event, a testament to the incredible power of Pope Urban's call, but also a grim and terrible warning of the dangers of pure, unguided fanaticism. And as the survivors straggled back to Constantinople with their harrowing tales of defeat, the great armies of the princes, the true military might of Western Christendom, were just beginning to arrive, ready to begin the real war. As the tragic story of the People's Crusade reached its grim conclusion on the plains of Anatolia, a different kind of army was beginning to assemble across the breadth of Europe. This was the force that Pope Urban had truly envisioned, not a chaotic mob of the desperate and the devout, but a disciplined, well-equipped, and professionally led military expedition. This was the Prince's Crusade, a grand and powerful host commanded by some of the most prominent nobles of Western Christendom. In the late summer and early autumn of 1096, four main contingents, like great rivers of steel flowing from different corners of the continent, began their long and arduous journey eastward. From the northern lands of Lorraine came a man who would become one of the most famous figures of the entire crusade, Godfrey of Bouillon. Imagine him now, a pious and disciplined military leader, his face serious, his gaze steady. He was a man of deep faith, and to finance his expedition, he had sold or mortgaged most of his vast lands, a testament to his unwavering commitment to the cause. He was accompanied by his two brothers, the ambitious Baldwin and the loyal Eustace. Their army was a formidable force, composed of seasoned knights from the heartlands of the old Carolingian Empire. From the sun-drenched lands of southern Italy came the Normans, led by the cunning and ambitious Bohemond of Taranto. He was a seasoned warrior, a man whose life had been a constant struggle for land and power. He had previously fought against the Byzantine Empire itself, and he brought to the crusade not just a small but highly professional force of knights, but also a sharp, calculating mind and a personal ambition that was equal in measure to his religious devotion. From the south of France, from the rich and cultured lands of Provence, came the largest contingent of all, commanded by the elderly and immensely wealthy Count Raymond of Toulouse. He was around 55 years old, ancient by the standards of medieval warfare, but his commitment to the crusade was absolute. He was one of the first and most powerful nobles to take the cross, and he had sworn a solemn vow that he would not return to his own lands until he had seen the holy city of Jerusalem liberated. And from northern France came the final great army, a collection of powerful nobles including Robert of Normandy, the son of William the Conqueror, the wealthy Robert of Flanders, and the influential Stephen of Blois. Each was a powerful ruler in his own right, though their contingent, unlike the others, lacked a single, undisputed leader. By the early months of the year 1097, these four great armies, after long and difficult journeys, had converged on the magnificent, sprawling city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Here, in this city of golden domes and ancient secrets, they encountered the man who had, in a sense, started it all, the Emperor Alexios. But the emperor was now deeply suspicious. The undisciplined chaos of the People's Crusade had alarmed him, and the arrival of this new, even more powerful Western army at his gates filled him with a profound unease. He demanded that the Crusade leaders swear an oath of fealty to him, and that they promise to return any former Byzantine territories they might conquer from the Turks. The negotiations were tense and protracted. The proud Western nobles chafed at the idea of swearing allegiance to the Greek emperor. But they needed his help. They needed his guides, his supplies, and his navy to transport them across the Bosphorus Strait into Asia. In the end, most of the leaders, some with more sincerity than others, swore the oath. With the delicate diplomacy concluded, the great combined Crusader army crossed into Anatolia. Their first major engagement came at the city of Nicaea, the Turkish capital in western Anatolia. It was a formidable fortress, and its capture was essential for securing their path eastward. The Crusaders, in a coordinated siege with the Byzantine forces, surrounded the city. For weeks, they battered its walls with siege engines, and in a final, decisive move, the Byzantine navy, transported overland in a remarkable feat of engineering, blockaded the city from the lake, cutting off its final line of supply. In June of 1097, the city surrendered. The following month, as the Crusaders marched deeper into the Anatolian plateau, they were ambushed by a massive Turkish army at a place called Dorylaeum. The battle was fierce and desperate. The Crusaders, caught by surprise, were nearly overwhelmed. But the discipline of the knights and the timely arrival of reinforcements from the other contingents turned the tide. The Crusaders repelled the Turkish counterattack, securing a major victory that opened their path across the vast and hostile plains of Anatolia. The journey that followed was a terrible ordeal. The army marched under a scorching summer sun, through a land that the retreating Turks had stripped of all food and water. The knights, in their heavy armor, suffered terribly from the heat, and their great warhorses began to die from thirst and starvation. The army endured, its resolve steeled by its faith, its numbers slowly dwindling not just from battle, but from the simple, grinding hardship of the march. And as they pushed ever eastward, they approached their next great obstacle, a city whose name would become synonymous with the suffering and the strange, miraculous triumphs of the First Crusade. They were approaching the ancient and formidable city of Antioch. As the autumn of 1097 began to paint the landscape in muted shades of gold and brown, the great Crusader army, weary from their long and punishing march across Anatolia, finally arrived before the ancient city of Antioch. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a simple knight or a common soldier in that vast host. They looked up, and before them rose a city that seemed less a work of men and more a creation of giants. Antioch was protected by massive walls, some of the most formidable in the entire world, which snaked for miles over hills and across valleys, their stone faces punctuated by the stern watchfulness of over 400 defensive towers. This was not a simple fortress to be taken in a single, glorious assault. This was a challenge that would require a different kind of strength, a strength born not of courage alone, but of immense, soul-crushing patience. The Crusader leaders, men like the pious Godfrey and the cunning Bohemond, established their great camp outside the city walls, and the long and grueling siege of Antioch began. But the city was well prepared. Its garrison was strong, its granaries were full, and it had access to supply lines that the Crusaders could not easily sever. As the weeks turned into months, the initial confidence of the Crusader army began to erode, replaced by a grim and familiar hardship. The surrounding countryside, which at first had provided some forage for their army, was soon stripped bare. And as the cold, damp winter of Syria set in, the situation in the Crusader camp grew increasingly desperate. This was a time of terrible suffering. The great enemy was no longer the Turkish spear or arrow, but the silent, creeping specter of starvation. Food became scarce, then almost non-existent. The price of a single loaf of bread became astronomical. Knights, who had set out from their grand castles in Europe, were now reduced to boiling leather hides for sustenance. The common soldiers fared even worse, foraging for roots and weeds, their bodies growing gaunt, their faces hollow with a deep, gnawing hunger. And with hunger came its twin sister, disease. The damp, unsanitary conditions of the vast military camp became a breeding ground for sickness. A terrible fever swept through the ranks, and the funeral pyres, which had burned for the casualties of battle, now burned day and night for the victims of pestilence. Morale, which had been so high after the victories at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, now plummeted to its lowest point. Men who had set out from their homes with their hearts filled with a fervent faith now found that faith being tested in a crucible of misery. The desertions began. At first, it was just a trickle of common soldiers, men who slipped away into the night, hoping to make the long journey home. But then, even some of the great nobles began to lose heart. In a devastating blow to the army's morale, Stephen of Blois, one of the most prominent and wealthiest leaders of the entire expedition, abandoned the enterprise, taking his large contingent of knights with him. The long, dark winter of the siege was a time of profound despair. But even in this darkest hour, the will of the Crusaders did not entirely break. Their leaders, particularly the ever-resourceful Bohemond, knew that the city could not be taken by force of arms alone. They would need to use cunning. And so, Bohemond began to look for a weakness, not in the city's stone walls, but in the hearts of the men who guarded them. He established secret contact with a man inside the city, an Armenian guard commander named Firas, who was responsible for a section of the Great Walls. Whether Firas was motivated by greed, by a secret sympathy for the Christian cause, or by some personal grievance against the city's rulers, the ancient sources do not say for certain. What is known is that after a series of secret negotiations, a bargain was struck. Firas agreed to betray the city. On the night of June 2, 1098, after 8 long and grueling months of siege, the plan was put into motion. Under the cover of a moonless, stormy night, a small, hand-picked group of Bohemond's Norman knights crept to the base of the section of the wall guarded by Firas. A rope ladder was lowered, and one by one, they scaled the massive wall. They quickly and silently dispatched the other guards and secured the tower. Then, they rushed to a nearby gate and opened it from the inside. The Crusader army, which had been waiting in the darkness with a tense, breathless anticipation, now poured into the sleeping city. The victory, when it came, was swift and brutal. After 8 months of pent-up frustration and suffering, the Crusaders showed little mercy to the city's inhabitants. But their triumph proved to be dangerously short-lived. Their long ordeal was not yet over. In fact, a new and even more terrible one was just about to begin. The triumph of the Crusaders inside the ancient walls of Antioch was savagely, brutally short-lived. They had captured one of the great cities of the East, but they were exhausted, their numbers depleted by the long siege, and their victory had been a chaotic and bloody affair. And just 3 days after they had poured through the city gates, new and far more terrible threat appeared on the horizon. A massive relief army, led by the powerful Turkish general Kerboga of Mosul, arrived and surrounded the city, trapping the exhausted Crusaders inside the very prize they had just won. The besiegers had become the besieged. The situation inside Antioch quickly became more desperate than anything they had endured during their own long siege. Retreat was now impossible. The city, which had itself just been through a prolonged siege, had been stripped of its remaining food supplies. And the Crusader army, now trapped, faced starvation once more. Their horses, essential for cavalry warfare, were the first to be consumed. Morale, which had soared so briefly in the moment of victory, now collapsed completely. The hope that had sustained them through the long march across Anatolia, the faith that had carried them through the dark winter, now seemed to be extinguished. Trapped in a hostile city, surrounded by a superior enemy, with no hope of reinforcement and their food running out, despair took hold of the army. It seemed as if their long and arduous journey had ended here, in a tomb of their own making. It was in this moment of absolute, profound desperation that a remarkable and transformative event occurred. A simple, uneducated peasant from Provence, a man named Peter Bartholomew, came before the Crusade leaders, his eyes wide with a strange and fervent light. He claimed to have received a series of divine visions. In his dreams, he said, Saint Andrew himself had appeared to him, revealing a great secret. The Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion, lay buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter, right here in Antioch. It was a sacred relic of immense power, and if they could find it, the saint had promised, it would be a sign of God's favor and would grant them an impossible victory. The leaders of the crusade were deeply divided by this strange pronouncement. Many, particularly the pragmatic and worldly Bohemond and other Norman leaders, were deeply skeptical. They saw it as the desperate fantasy of a starving peasant. But others, like the pious and devout Count Raymond of Toulouse, were more inclined to believe. In an age when the line between the material and the spiritual was thin, when relics and divine signs were a very real and powerful part of people's worldview, the possibility of such a miracle could not be entirely dismissed. In the end, with no other options and with their army on the brink of total collapse, they agreed to allow an excavation. Imagine the scene. A small group of men, led by Peter Bartholomew himself, gather in the deep, solemn quiet of the ancient cathedral. By the flickering light of a few torches, they begin to dig into the cold, stone floor. For hours, they work, their shovels striking stone, the sound echoing through the vast, empty church. They dig deeper and deeper, but they find nothing. The skepticism of the leaders begins to feel justified. The hope that had flickered so briefly begins to fade. But Peter Bartholomew, his faith unshaken, leaps into the pit himself and begins to dig with his bare hands. And then, a cry rings out. He has found something. From the earth, he pulls a simple, rusted, iron point. Whether this was the authentic Holy Lance, or a conveniently discovered piece of metal, or something else entirely, is a question that historians have debated for centuries. But in that moment, for the starving, desperate, and trapped Crusader army, it did not matter. The discovery electrified the common soldiers. It was a miracle. Their suffering, their starvation, their long ordeal, it had all been a test of their faith, and now, God had sent them a sign. A wave of renewed, ecstatic, and unshakable religious fervor swept through the camp. Their despair was burned away, replaced by an absolute certainty that they were an army of God, and that with this sacred relic to lead them, they were invincible. On the 28th of June 1098, a remarkable procession emerged from the gates of Antioch. It was not a retreating army, but a confident, holy host, marching out to face an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. At their head, the Holy Lance was carried aloft as their battle standard. Against all military logic, against all reasonable expectation, the reinvigorated Crusader army, fueled by a combination of desperate courage and divine certainty, routed Kerboga's superior force. The great Turkish army, itself plagued by internal divisions, collapsed and fled. The Crusaders, and many contemporary chroniclers, attributed this stunning victory to nothing less than divine intervention. They had been saved. The triumph at Antioch, however, created its own new complications. The cunning Bohemond, who had engineered the initial capture of the city, now claimed it as his own personal prize, despite the oath he had sworn to the Byzantine emperor. This act established the first of the great Crusader states, the Principality of Antioch, and it set a precedent for the acquisition of territory that would shape the rest of the crusade. After months of recuperation, the main Crusader army, its numbers now significantly reduced, but its spirit high, was ready to continue its journey. The path to their ultimate goal, the holy city of Jerusalem, was now finally open. In the decades that followed the First Crusade, a new and unique world was born on the shores of the Levant. The four Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa, formed a narrow ribbon of Christian-ruled territory, a world the French-speaking knights who ruled it called Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea. It was a strange and vibrant hybrid society, a place where Western European feudal customs mingled with the ancient traditions of the Middle East. Great stone castles, built in the European style, now stood guard over dusty landscapes dotted with olive groves and palm trees. Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa filled the ports of cities like Acre and Tyre, their ships carrying spices, silks, and glass back to the west, creating a new and prosperous artery of trade. For a time, a fragile but functioning coexistence was established between the Christian rulers and their mostly Muslim and Eastern Christian subjects. But this new world was built on a precarious foundation. In the year 1144, the northernmost of the Crusader states, the county of Edessa, fell to the powerful Turkish ruler of Mosul, a man named Zengi. The news of the fall of the First Crusader city sent a shockwave through Western Europe, and Pope Eugene III issued a call for a new crusade, a second crusade, to reclaim the lost territory and reinforce the remaining states. This time, the call was answered not just by nobles, but by the two most powerful kings in Europe, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. Their expedition, however, was a dismal and poorly coordinated failure. It achieved nothing of military significance and only served to further strain the relationship between the Crusaders and their Byzantine allies, while demonstrating to the Muslim world that the once invincible Franks were, in fact, beatable. The failure of the Second Crusade left the remaining Crusader states more vulnerable than ever before, and it created the conditions for the rise of a new and far more formidable adversary. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. He was a Kurdish warrior who rose from humble beginnings to become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, uniting the once fractured Muslim powers of the region under his single, charismatic leadership. Saladin was a man of deep piety, of great personal integrity, and of a chivalrous and merciful nature that was legendary even among his enemies. But he was also a brilliant military strategist and a patient, determined leader, and he dedicated his life to a single, sacred goal: to drive the Christian invaders from the Holy Land and to reclaim the city of Jerusalem for Islam. For years, Saladin consolidated his power, slowly and methodically encircling the Crusader kingdoms. The final confrontation came in the summer of 1187. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, led by their king, Guy of Lusignan, made a series of catastrophic strategic errors. Against all sound military advice, they marched their entire army out into the arid, waterless desert to confront Saladin's forces. The result was the Battle of Hattin. Imagine the scene: the Crusader knights, in their heavy chainmail armor, trapped under a brutal summer sun, tormented by thirst, surrounded and harassed by Saladin's swift horse archers. The battle was not just a defeat, it was a total catastrophe. The Crusader army was annihilated, and the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, a fragment believed to be from the true cross, was captured on the battlefield. With the army of Jerusalem destroyed, the kingdom was left defenseless. Saladin swept through the land, and on October 2, 1187, after a brief siege, the city of Jerusalem surrendered to him. The contrast between this capture and the bloody conquest of the First Crusade 88 years earlier could not have been more stark. There was no massacre. Saladin, true to his chivalrous reputation, allowed the citizens of Jerusalem to ransom their freedom, and those who could not pay were, for the most part, allowed to leave peacefully. His mercy and magnanimity in this moment of ultimate triumph became a legend, earning him the grudging respect of all of Europe. The news of the fall of Jerusalem once again plunged the West into a state of shock and grief. A new call for a crusade, the Third Crusade, went out, and this time, it was answered by the three greatest monarchs of the age. There was the elderly but still formidable Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, the cunning and politically astute King Philip II of France, and the most famous warrior king of his time, Richard I of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. The crusade began with a tragedy. The great Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, while leading his massive German army overland, drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia. His death caused his army to largely disintegrate, a terrible blow to the crusading cause before it had even truly begun. The other two kings, Philip of France and Richard of England, who were bitter political rivals at home, arrived by sea at the great port city of Acre, which had been under a long and grueling siege by the remaining Christian forces for 2 years. The arrival of these two powerful kings and their armies finally turned the tide, and in July of 1291, the city of Acre surrendered to the Crusaders. But the rivalry between the two kings soon boiled over. Philip, more interested in his political schemes back in France, used an illness as a pretext to abandon the crusade and return home, leaving Richard as the sole and undisputed leader of the Christian forces. And it was now that the Third Crusade transformed into something more personal, a great duel of champions, a contest of will, strategy, and character between the two greatest leaders of their age, Richard the Lionheart and the Sultan Saladin. What followed was not a story of grand, sweeping conquests, but a series of brilliant, hard-fought campaigns up and down the coast, a chess match between two masters. Richard was a peerless battlefield commander, a man of incredible personal courage and ferocious energy. He led from the front, his great battle-axe cleaving a path through enemy ranks. At the Battle of Arsuf, he executed a brilliant and disciplined fighting march, repelling Saladin's repeated attacks and inflicting a rare and significant defeat upon the Sultan's forces. But for all their enmity on the battlefield, a strange and powerful mutual respect grew between these two great men. They were, in many ways, mirror images of each other, the embodiment of the chivalric ideal of their respective cultures. A series of legendary anecdotes illustrates this unique relationship. It is said that during one battle, when Richard's horse was killed from under him, Saladin, seeing his great rival fighting on foot, sent him 2 fresh Arab chargers as a gift, stating that it was not fitting for such a great king to fight like a common soldier. On another occasion, when Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin sent him fresh fruit, snow from the mountains to cool his drinks, and even his own personal physician to attend to him. They communicated through envoys, exchanging not just threats and demands, but also gifts and messages of grudging admiration. In the end, Richard, for all his military victories, came to understand that he lacked the manpower to retake and, more importantly, to hold the city of Jerusalem. And Saladin, for his part, had come to respect the incredible tenacity and military prowess of the Lionheart, and knew that a prolonged war would be ruinously expensive for his own empire. And so, in September of 1292, the two great rivals concluded a truce. The treaty left the coastal cities in Christian hands and, most importantly, guaranteed unarmed Christian pilgrims safe access to the holy sites in Jerusalem. The Third Crusade was over. It had failed in its primary objective of retaking Jerusalem, but it had succeeded in saving the Crusader states from complete annihilation and had secured the rights of pilgrims. Richard the Lionheart, his quest incomplete but his personal legend secured for all time, set sail for home, leaving Saladin as the undisputed master of the Holy City. The great Duel of Heroes had ended not with a final, cataclysmic battle, but with a weary, pragmatic, and deeply respectful stalemate, a fitting conclusion to the most chivalrous and legendary chapter in the long and complex history of the Crusades. In the decades that followed the First Crusade, a new and unique world was born on the shores of the Levant. The 4 Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa, formed a narrow ribbon of Christian-ruled territory, a world the French-speaking knights who ruled it called Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea. It was a strange and vibrant hybrid society, a place where Western European feudal customs mingled with the ancient traditions of the Middle East. Great stone castles, built in the European style, now stood guard over dusty landscapes dotted with olive groves and palm trees. Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa filled the ports of cities like Acre and Tyre, their ships carrying spices, silks, and glass back to the west, creating a new and prosperous artery of trade. For a time, a fragile but functioning coexistence was established between the Christian rulers and their mostly Muslim and Eastern Christian subjects. But this new world was built on a precarious foundation. In the year 1144, the northernmost of the Crusader states, the county of Edessa, fell to the powerful Turkish ruler of Mosul, a man named Zengi. The news of the fall of the First Crusader city sent a shockwave through Western Europe, and Pope Eugene III issued a call for a new crusade, a Second Crusade, to reclaim the lost territory and reinforce the remaining states. This time, the call was answered not just by nobles, but by the 2 most powerful kings in Europe, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. Their expedition, however, was a dismal and poorly coordinated failure. It achieved nothing of military significance and only served to further strain the relationship between the Crusaders and their Byzantine allies, while demonstrating to the Muslim world that the once invincible Franks were, in fact, beatable. The failure of the Second Crusade left the remaining Crusader states more vulnerable than ever before, and it created the conditions for the rise of a new and far more formidable adversary. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. He was a Kurdish warrior who rose from humble beginnings to become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, uniting the once fractured Muslim powers of the region under his single, charismatic leadership. Saladin was a man of deep piety, of great personal integrity, and of a chivalrous and merciful nature that was legendary even among his enemies. But he was also a brilliant military strategist and a patient, determined leader, and he dedicated his life to a single, sacred goal: to drive the Christian invaders from the Holy Land and to reclaim the city of Jerusalem for Islam. For years, Saladin consolidated his power, slowly and methodically encircling the Crusader kingdoms. The final confrontation came in the summer of 1187. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, led by their king, Guy of Lusignan, made a series of catastrophic strategic errors. Against all sound military advice, they marched their entire army out into the arid, waterless desert to confront Saladin's forces. The result was the Battle of Hattin. Imagine the scene: the Crusader knights, in their heavy chainmail armor, trapped under a brutal summer sun, tormented by thirst, surrounded and harassed by Saladin's swift horse archers. The battle was not just a defeat, it was a total catastrophe. The Crusader army was annihilated, and the most sacred relic in all of Christendom, a fragment believed to be from the true cross, was captured on the battlefield. With the army of Jerusalem destroyed, the kingdom was left defenseless. Saladin swept through the land, and on October 2, 1187, after a brief siege, the city of Jerusalem surrendered to him. The contrast between this capture and the bloody conquest of the First Crusade 88 years earlier could not have been more stark. There was no massacre. Saladin, true to his chivalrous reputation, allowed the citizens of Jerusalem to ransom their freedom, and those who could not pay were, for the most part, allowed to leave peacefully. His mercy and magnanimity in this moment of ultimate triumph became a legend, earning him the grudging respect of all of Europe. The news of the fall of Jerusalem once again plunged the West into a state of shock and grief. A new call for a crusade, the Third Crusade, went out, and this time, it was answered by the three greatest monarchs of the age. There was the elderly but still formidable Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, the cunning and politically astute King Philip II of France, and the most famous warrior king of his time, Richard I of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart. The crusade began with a tragedy. The great Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, while leading his massive German army overland, drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia. His death caused his army to largely disintegrate, a terrible blow to the crusading cause before it had even truly begun. The other two kings, Philip of France and Richard of England, who were bitter political rivals at home, arrived by sea at the great port city of Acre, which had been under a long and grueling siege by the remaining Christian forces for 2 years. The arrival of these two powerful kings and their armies finally turned the tide, and in July of 1291, the city of Acre surrendered to the Crusaders. But the rivalry between the two kings soon boiled over. Philip, more interested in his political schemes back in France, used an illness as a pretext to abandon the crusade and return home, leaving Richard as the sole and undisputed leader of the Christian forces. And it was now that the Third Crusade transformed into something more personal, a great duel of champions, a contest of will, strategy, and character between the two greatest leaders of their age, Richard the Lionheart and the Sultan Saladin. What followed was not a story of grand, sweeping conquests, but a series of brilliant, hard-fought campaigns up and down the coast, a chess match between two masters. Richard was a peerless battlefield commander, a man of incredible personal courage and ferocious energy. He led from the front, his great battle-axe cleaving a path through enemy ranks. At the Battle of Arsuf, he executed a brilliant and disciplined fighting march, repelling Saladin's repeated attacks and inflicting a rare and significant defeat upon the Sultan's forces. But for all their enmity on the battlefield, a strange and powerful mutual respect grew between these two great men. They were, in many ways, mirror images of each other, the embodiment of the chivalric ideal of their respective cultures. A series of legendary anecdotes illustrates this unique relationship. It is said that during one battle, when Richard's horse was killed from under him, Saladin, seeing his great rival fighting on foot, sent him 2 fresh Arab chargers as a gift, stating that it was not fitting for such a great king to fight like a common soldier. On another occasion, when Richard fell ill with a fever, Saladin sent him fresh fruit, snow from the mountains to cool his drinks, and even his own personal physician to attend to him. They communicated through envoys, exchanging not just threats and demands, but also gifts and messages of grudging admiration. In the end, Richard, for all his military victories, came to understand that he lacked the manpower to retake and, more importantly, to hold the city of Jerusalem. And Saladin, for his part, had come to respect the incredible tenacity and military prowess of the Lionheart, and knew that a prolonged war would be ruinously expensive for his own empire. And so, in September of 1292, the two great rivals concluded a truce. The treaty left the coastal cities in Christian hands and, most importantly, guaranteed unarmed Christian pilgrims safe access to the holy sites in Jerusalem. The Third Crusade was over. It had failed in its primary objective of retaking Jerusalem, but it had succeeded in saving the Crusader states from complete annihilation and had secured the rights of pilgrims. Richard the Lionheart, his quest incomplete but his personal legend secured for all time, set sail for home, leaving Saladin as the undisputed master of the Holy City. The great Duel of Heroes had ended not with a final, cataclysmic battle, but with a weary, pragmatic, and deeply respectful stalemate, a fitting conclusion to the most chivalrous and legendary chapter in the long and complex history of the Crusades. In the years that followed the Third Crusade, a new and powerful figure ascended to the papal throne in Rome. He was Pope Innocent III, a man of brilliant intellect, administrative genius, and an ambitious vision of the papacy as the supreme moral and political authority in all of Christendom. He looked upon the state of the Holy Land with a heavy heart. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, and he believed it was his sacred duty to launch a new crusade, one that would finally succeed where others had failed. In 1198, he issued a call to arms, but this time, with a new and carefully considered strategy. The crusade would not march overland through the treacherous mountains of Anatolia, nor would it strike directly at the heavily fortified cities of the Levant. Instead, it would attack the very heart of Muslim power, Egypt. Innocent III, a keen strategist, recognized that Egypt was the economic engine of the Ayyubid Sultanate. To conquer Egypt would be to cut off the head of the serpent, securing a powerful and wealthy base from which to easily reclaim the Holy Land. The call was answered by many of the great nobles of France, led by men like Theobald of Champagne and Boniface of Montferrat. Recognizing the need for a massive fleet to transport their army to the shores of Egypt, they sent envoys to negotiate with the preeminent maritime power of the Mediterranean, the great, wealthy, and powerful Republic of Venice. Imagine the scene. The Crusader envoys arrive in the magnificent city of Venice, a city that seems to rise like a dream from the waters of the lagoon. They are brought before the ruler of the Republic, the Doge, Enrico Dandolo. He is an old man, nearly 90 years of age, and he is blind. But his mind is as sharp and as keen as any man in Europe. A complex and shrewd bargain was struck. Venice would construct and provide a massive fleet, enough to transport some 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, and would provide provisions for 9 months. In exchange, the Crusaders would pay the immense sum of 85,000 silver marks. The Crusader leaders, confident in their ability to raise the necessary forces, readily agreed. This financial arrangement, however, would prove to be disastrous. In the summer of 1202, as the Crusaders began to assemble in Venice, it became clear that their numbers were far, far smaller than they had anticipated. Only about 1/3 of the expected Crusaders had arrived. Many had chosen other routes, or had abandoned the enterprise altogether. The leaders found themselves in a terrible position. They had gathered all the money they could, liquidating their own personal assets, but they still fell 34,000 marks short of the required payment. They were trapped, indebted to the Venetians, their great army unable to sail, stranded on the Lido island, a golden cage from which there seemed to be no escape. It was then that the blind Doge, Enrico Dandolo, proposed a solution, a gambit that would change the course of history. He suggested that the Crusaders could defer their debt by assisting Venice in a small military matter. They could help Venice recapture the nearby port city of Zara, a Christian city that had rebelled against Venetian rule and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. The Crusader leaders were horrified. To attack a Christian city, a city ruled by a fellow Christian king who had himself taken the Crusaders' vow, was unthinkable. It was a perversion of their sacred mission. When Pope Innocent III learned of this plan, he explicitly forbade it and threatened to excommunicate anyone who participated. But the Crusaders were desperate. They had no other options. And so, reluctantly, their hearts heavy with a sense of shame, they agreed. In November of 1202, the Great Crusader fleet, with the Venetian navy at its side, besieged and captured the Christian city of Zara. While the Crusaders were wintering in the conquered city, their spirits low, their mission already compromised, a new and unexpected proposal arrived, an offer that seemed like a miraculous solution to all their problems. Envoys arrived from a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos. His father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed and blinded by his own brother, who now ruled in Constantinople. The young prince made the Crusaders an astonishing offer. If they would sail to Constantinople and help restore his father to the throne, he would pay off their entire debt to Venice, he would provide them with provisions and an army of 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to help them conquer Egypt, and, most astoundingly of all, he promised to end the great schism that had divided the Eastern and Western churches for centuries, bringing the Greek Orthodox Church back under the authority of the Pope in Rome. The offer was immensely tempting. It seemed to solve all their problems at once. But it also created deep divisions within the Crusader leadership. Some argued passionately that this was yet another, even greater, diversion from their true purpose. But others, led by Boniface of Montferrat and encouraged by the Venetians, argued that this detour would ultimately strengthen the crusade, providing it with the funds and the manpower it needed to succeed. In the end, the Byzantine proposal prevailed. The Fourth Crusade, which had been intended for the shores of Muslim Egypt, now set its sails for the walls of Christian Constantinople. In June of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived before the magnificent city, the greatest Christian city in the world. After a brief siege, the usurper emperor fled, and the blind Isaac II and his son Alexios IV were restored to the throne. The Crusaders had apparently achieved their objective. But their triumph was an illusion. The new emperors, their treasury already depleted, found it impossible to pay the enormous sum they had promised. As the months passed, relations between the Crusaders, who were camped outside the city, and the Byzantines grew increasingly hostile. In January of 1204, a popular uprising in the city led to a palace coup. The young Alexios IV was strangled, his blind father died shortly after, and a new, anti-Latin emperor, Alexios V, was placed on the throne. The Crusaders were now in a desperate position. Their supposed ally was dead, a hostile emperor was on the throne, and they were still stranded, far from their goal, with no money and dwindling supplies. Economic necessity, a sense of betrayal, and the prospect of unimaginable plunder led them to make their final, terrible decision. They would take the great city for themselves. On April 12, 1204, they launched their final assault. And this time, they succeeded. What followed was 3 days of indiscriminate looting, destruction, and violence that shocked even the hardened medieval world. The Crusaders, the soldiers of the cross, descended upon the city like a pack of wolves. They systematically stripped the magnificent churches of their priceless relics and their treasures of gold and silver. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the grandest building in all of Christendom, had its great silver altar smashed to pieces. Countless ancient manuscripts, works of art, and historical records, the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 years, were lost forever in the fires and the chaos. It was a tragedy of incalculable proportions, a wound in the heart of Christendom that would never truly heal. The Fourth Crusade, which had begun with such pious intentions, had ended in a sacrilegious and catastrophic betrayal, leaving behind it a conquered and burning city, and a legacy of bitterness and mistrust that would divide the Christian world for centuries to come. The Sixth Crusade stands as one of the most unusual and paradoxical episodes in the entire history of the Holy Wars. It was a campaign that would achieve through the quiet, patient art of diplomacy what 5 previous expeditions had largely failed to accomplish through the sound and fury of warfare. And its central figure was perhaps the most remarkable and enigmatic ruler of the entire medieval period, the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, a man who was known to his contemporaries as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Imagine a court not in the damp, stone castles of France or Germany, but in the sun-drenched, cosmopolitan world of Palermo, in Sicily. Here, Frederick presided over a kingdom where Latin Christians, Greek Orthodox, Muslims, and Jews all lived and worked together. He was a man of extraordinary intellect, educated in this vibrant, multicultural environment. He spoke 6 languages, including Arabic. He was a poet, a scientist, and a philosopher, his mind as comfortable discussing the finer points of Aristotelian logic with a Muslim scholar as it was discussing the arts of falconry. This was the man who, at his imperial coronation in 1220, had taken a solemn vow to lead a new crusade to recover Jerusalem. In 1225, this commitment was made even more personal when he married Isabella II, the young Queen of Jerusalem, making him the titular king of the very city he had sworn to reclaim. Despite these powerful incentives, Frederick repeatedly delayed his departure. He was a complex man, embroiled in a constant and bitter power struggle with the papacy, and with the rebellious Lombard cities of northern Italy. The new pope, Gregory IX, a stern and uncompromising man, was less patient than his predecessor. When Frederick once again delayed his departure in 1227, citing a sudden illness, the pope's patience finally broke. He excommunicated the emperor. This created an unprecedented and bizarre situation. The leader of the next great crusade was now an excommunicate, a man cast out from the very church he was supposed to be defending. Undeterred, Frederick, determined to fulfill his vow on his own terms, finally departed for the east in June of 1228. He arrived not with a massive army, but with a relatively small force of elite knights. He knew that this would not be a war won by brute force. And upon his arrival in the Holy Land, he found a political situation that was unexpectedly favorable for his unique approach. The Ayyubid Sultanate, which had been so united under Saladin, was now fractured by internal rivalries. The Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, a nephew of Saladin and a sophisticated and pragmatic ruler in his own right, was locked in a power struggle with his own relatives in Damascus and Syria. He was in need of allies, and he saw in this strange, excommunicated European emperor a potential, if temporary, partner. The two leaders had already established diplomatic contacts several years earlier, exchanging not just envoys, but gifts and philosophical discussions. They were two of the most cultured and intelligent rulers of their age, and they recognized in each other a shared capacity for pragmatic, rational thought. And so, while the more zealous Crusader leaders and military orders in the Holy Land fumed at the idea of negotiating with the infidel, and refused to fully cooperate with the excommunicated emperor, Frederick and Al-Kamil began a series of direct, complex, and private negotiations. For 5 long months, their envoys traveled back and forth, their discussions a masterclass in diplomacy, a quiet, intricate chess game played for the highest of stakes. Finally, in February of 1229, the two rulers concluded the Treaty of Jaffa. Its terms were astonishing, achieving through words what generations of crusaders had failed to achieve through war. The holy city of Jerusalem, along with Bethlehem and Nazareth and a corridor to the coast, would be returned to Christian control. Muslims would retain their religious rights at the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. And a 10-year truce would be respected by both sides. The reaction to this diplomatic triumph was polarized. Frederick's supporters hailed it as a work of genius. He had recovered Christianity's holiest sites without shedding a single drop of blood. But his many detractors, particularly the clergy loyal to the Pope, saw it as an unconscionable compromise. They were horrified that he had allowed Muslims to retain a place of worship in the Holy City, and they saw his treaty, made by an excommunicate, as a sacrilegious pact with the enemy. The contradictions of his crusade reached their apex when Frederick himself entered Jerusalem to take possession of his new kingdom. On March 17, 1229, he processed into the Holy City as its Christian ruler, a triumphant moment that fulfilled the core objective of the entire crusading movement. Yet, because of his excommunication, the city was placed under a papal interdict. No church bells rang. No masses were said. In the great, silent church of the Holy Sepulchre, Frederick reportedly took the crown of Jerusalem and placed it upon his own head, as no religious authority would perform the coronation of an excommunicated emperor. This strange, quiet victory was to be short-lived. Just as the emperor had achieved his goal through diplomacy, a different and far more tragic story, born of a purer and more naive faith, had played out in the fields and on the roads of Europe some years before. This was the heartbreaking episode known as the Children's Crusade. Imagine a time of intense religious fervor, when the stories of the Holy War had captured the imagination of everyone, from the highest noble to the humblest peasant. In this supercharged atmosphere, 2 young shepherd boys, one in Germany and one in France, independently began to preach. The first was a German boy named Nicholas of Cologne, who claimed to have received a divine vision. He believed that he could succeed where the great armies had failed, that he could convert the Muslims of the Holy Land not through violence, but through the simple power of faith. He began to preach, and his charismatic innocence attracted a massive following. Thousands upon thousands of children, along with a number of adults, joined his cause. He led his great procession southward, over the treacherous, snow-covered passes of the Alps, on a long and arduous journey toward Italy. They believed that when they reached the sea, God would perform a miracle, parting the waters for them as he had for Moses, allowing them to walk to the Holy Land on dry ground. But the journey was a terrible ordeal. The cold and the hunger took a heavy toll. Many of the children perished in the mountains. When the ragged survivors finally reached the Italian city of Genoa, they stood before the sea and they prayed. But the sea did not part. Their faith, so pure and so absolute, had been met with the unyielding reality of the physical world. Broken-hearted and disillusioned, many of the children simply remained in Genoa, while others attempted the long, sorrowful journey back home. At the same time, in France, another shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes was having similar visions. He, too, gathered a great following of thousands of children. He led them to the port city of Marseilles, also believing that the sea would part for them. And again, when they reached the shore, no miracle occurred. But in the harbor, two merchants saw an opportunity. They offered to provide the children with ships, to transport them to the Holy Land free of charge, as an act of piety. The children, their hope renewed, joyfully boarded the 7 ships. But it was a terrible betrayal. The 2 merchants were not pious men, they were slave traders. 2 of the ships were wrecked in a storm, but the other 5 sailed not to the Holy Land, but to the shores of North Africa, where the surviving children were sold into slavery. The story of the Children's Crusade, though shrouded in legend and historical uncertainty, stands as a poignant and heartbreaking lament, a testament to the immense power of faith in the medieval world, and to its potential for both profound inspiration and terrible, tragic delusion. It is a quiet, sorrowful counterpoint to the grand, political maneuvering of emperors and popes. It reminds us that behind the great movements of history, behind the armies and the treaties, there are always the individual human hearts, with their capacity for great faith, for great hope, and for great, heartbreaking sorrow. In the years following the unorthodox and controversial crusade of Emperor Frederick II, the situation for the Christian kingdom in the Holy Land grew increasingly dire. The holy city of Jerusalem, which had been recovered so remarkably through diplomacy, was violently recaptured by Khwarezmian mercenaries in 1244. Its Christian inhabitants were massacred, and its holy sites desecrated. This catastrophe was compounded by the crushing defeat of the Crusader states' army at the Battle of La Forbie, a disaster that shattered their remaining military strength. The news that reached Europe was one of profound crisis, but it arrived at a time when the papacy was embroiled in its own bitter conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, and the other kings of Europe were preoccupied with their own internal concerns. The call for a new crusade was answered by a man who was, in many ways, the very embodiment of medieval Christian kingship, Louis IX of France, a ruler who would later be canonized as Saint Louis. Louis was a man of exceptional and profound piety. He was a king who attended multiple masses daily, who engaged in severe acts of self-mortification, and who would personally feed and care for lepers, seeing the face of Christ in the suffering of the poor. His decision to undertake a crusade stemmed from a near-death experience during a severe illness in 1244. Upon his recovery, he made a solemn vow to take the cross. And when the news of Jerusalem's fall arrived shortly thereafter, Louis interpreted it as a divine confirmation of his sacred duty. Unlike many previous expeditions, which had been organized with a great deal of haste, Louis's crusade was a model of methodical and careful preparation. For 4 long years, he put the affairs of his kingdom in order and systematically addressed the logistical, financial, and diplomatic prerequisites for a major overseas campaign. He imposed substantial taxes throughout France, including an unprecedented levy on the revenues of the church, to ensure that his army would be well funded. He undertook a series of diplomatic initiatives, even exchanging envoys with the distant Mongol Khans, exploring the possibility of a grand alliance against their common Muslim enemies. He commissioned the construction of a great fleet of specialized transport ships, determined to avoid the logistical disasters that had plagued so many earlier efforts. In August of 1248, the Seventh Crusade departed from the south of France. Louis had assembled a formidable army of approximately 15,000 men, including some 2,500 elite knights. Their first destination was the island of Cyprus, where they spent the winter gathering supplies and awaiting reinforcements. Drawing on the lessons of the Fifth Crusade, Louis resolved to attack Egypt first, recognizing that it was the economic and military heart of Ayyubid power. In the spring of 1249, the Crusader fleet reached the coast of Egypt, near the fortified port city of Damietta. The landing was met with immediate opposition. But in one of the Crusade's most dramatic moments, King Louis himself, a tall and imposing figure, leaped from his ship into the chest-high water of the Nile Delta, leading his knights ashore under a hail of enemy fire. This act of personal courage inspired his troops, who successfully established a beachhead and drove the Egyptian defenders from their positions. Then, to the Crusaders' great surprise, the Egyptian forces hastily abandoned the city of Damietta itself, retreating toward Cairo without destroying the city's provisions or infrastructure. It was a stunning and seemingly providential victory. But at this critical juncture, Louis made a fateful decision. He chose to wait in Damietta for several months for the arrival of his brother, Alphonse of Poitiers, with additional forces. This long delay sacrificed all the momentum they had gained and allowed the Egyptians, despite being in the midst of a succession crisis after their Sultan died, to reorganize their defenses and prepare for the Crusader advance. In November of 1249, with his reinforcements finally arrived, Louis ordered the advance toward Cairo. The army marched south, towards the city of Mansoura, the very same objective that had proven so disastrous for the Fifth Crusade 30 years earlier. The initial stages of the battle for Mansoura went well, but this success led to a catastrophe. The king's brother, Robert of Artois, leading the vanguard of the army, disregarded explicit instructions to wait for the main force. Overconfident, he led a rash cavalry charge directly into the narrow streets of Mansoura. The Crusader vanguard was quickly trapped in the labyrinthine city and annihilated. This catastrophic loss of his elite heavy cavalry was a blow from which the army would never fully recover. For the next 2 months, the opposing armies engaged in a war of attrition. But with their supply lines cut by the Egyptian fleet on the Nile, the Crusader camp soon faced severe food shortages. Disease, particularly scurvy and dysentery, spread rapidly through the weakened army. In April of 1250, with his army on the brink of collapse, Louis ordered a general retreat back toward Damietta. But it was too late. The Egyptian forces quickly surrounded the withdrawing army, and after a decisive defeat, King Louis IX, too weak from his own illness to ride, was captured, along with most of the surviving French nobility. Never before had a reigning European monarch fallen prisoner to Muslim forces. In his captivity, Louis demonstrated a remarkable composure and royal dignity, negotiating his own ransom. In exchange for the surrender of Damietta and an enormous sum of money, the king and his nobles were released. But upon his release, Louis made another unexpected decision. Rather than returning to France in defeat, he proceeded to the city of Acre, the capital of the remnant kingdom of Jerusalem. He would remain in the Holy Land for 4 long years, an unprecedented commitment for a European monarch. During this time, he focused on strengthening the Crusader state's defensive capabilities, personally participating in the massive refortification of key coastal cities like Acre, Caesarea, and Jaffa. He was finally forced to return to France in 1254, after news arrived of the death of his mother, who had been ruling as regent in his absence. His first great quest had ended in military defeat, but his personal piety and his tireless work to rebuild the defenses of the Holy Land had earned him immense respect throughout Christendom. Years later, as an old man, still consumed by his crusading vow, he would undertake one last expedition, the Eighth Crusade. But this time, influenced by his brother, Charles of Anjou, the target was not Egypt, but the city of Tunis in North Africa. The expedition landed in the heat of summer in 1270 and was immediately beset by disease. Louis himself fell ill, and on August 25, 1270, he died in his tent on the shores of a foreign land, reportedly lying on a bed of ashes as a final act of religious humility. His last words were said to have been a quiet, sorrowful whisper, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." The quest of the Saint King was over. In the years that followed the death of the pious King Louis IX of France on the sands of Tunisia, a deep and weary resignation settled over the Christian West. The great age of the Crusades, that powerful movement of faith and steel that had defined the European spirit for nearly 2 centuries, was drawing to a close. The passion that had once sent hundreds of thousands on the long road to Jerusalem had faded, replaced by a growing preoccupation with internal European conflicts and a sense of disillusionment with the endless, costly, and ultimately fruitless wars in the distant East. But in the Holy Land itself, in that narrow, fragile strip of coastal territory known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the struggle for survival continued. The world of Outremer was now a shadow of its former self, a collection of fortified coastal cities clinging precariously to the edge of a hostile continent. And it now faced its most formidable and relentless adversary yet, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks were a new and powerful force, a military caste of former slave soldiers who had seized power in Cairo. They were disciplined, ruthless, and utterly dedicated to the final eradication of the Frankish presence from their lands. The first great Mamluk Sultan to turn his full attention to this task was a man named Baibars, a brilliant and brutal military genius. One by one, with methodical precision, he began to dismantle the remaining Crusader castles and cities. Great fortresses that had been considered impregnable for generations, like the mighty Croc de Chevaliers, fell to his siege engines and his sappers. The once proud Principality of Antioch, the very first of the Crusader states, was captured and utterly destroyed in 1268, its population massacred or sold into slavery. A wave of terror swept through the remaining Christian cities. In the midst of this onslaught, one last, small-scale crusade, which historians would later call the Ninth Crusade, was launched from the west. It was led by the young and energetic Prince Edward of England, the man who would later become the famous King Edward I, Longshanks. He arrived at the great port city of Acre in 1271 with a small force of only about 1,000 knights. Though he was a skilled and courageous commander, he quickly realized that his small army was utterly insufficient to challenge the full might of the Mamluk Sultanate. He achieved some minor successes and managed to negotiate a 10-year truce, but his expedition was ultimately a valiant but futile gesture, the final, flickering ember of the great crusading fire. After an assassination attempt on his life, he was forced to return to England to claim his own throne, leaving the beleaguered Crusader kingdom to its fate. The final act of this long and bloody drama would be played out in the last great bastion of Christian power in the Holy Land, the magnificent port city of Acre. Imagine Acre in its final years. It was a city of vibrant, chaotic, and ultimately fatal contradictions. It was the capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a bustling hub of commerce where the wealth of the East and West flowed through its crowded markets. Its harbor was filled with the ships of the great Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, whose merchants had grown rich from the pilgrim and trade routes. And its defenses were manned by the last, proud remnants of the great military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights. But beneath this glittering surface, the city was hopelessly divided. The Venetian and Genoese merchants fought their own bitter trade wars in the city streets. The great military orders were fierce rivals, often working at cross purposes. And the titular king of Jerusalem held little real authority over this fractious and quarrelsome collection of competing interests. In the spring of 1291, the final storm arrived. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Ashraf Khalil, assembled a massive army, one of the largest of the entire medieval period, and marched on Acre. He brought with him an enormous siege train of over 100 massive catapults and trebuchets. The defenders of Acre, numbering perhaps 15,000 fighting men, looked out from their high walls at a sea of enemies that stretched to the horizon. They knew that this was the final battle. There would be no reinforcements from the west. There would be no retreat. The siege that followed was one of the most desperate and heroic in the entire history of the Crusades. For over a month, the city endured a relentless, round-the-clock bombardment. The great Mamluk siege engines hurled massive stones against the city's double walls, slowly, methodically, grinding them down. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of men with nothing left to lose. The knights of the military orders led daring sorties out of the city gates, attempting to disrupt the siege works, but they were driven back by the sheer weight of Mamluk numbers. Finally, on May 18, 1291, after weeks of constant bombardment, the Mamluks breached the outer wall. A desperate, bloody battle raged in the space between the two walls. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. The Mamluks poured through the breach, and the city's defenses collapsed into a chaotic, street-by-street fight for survival. The city fell into a wave of slaughter and destruction. Those who could, fled to the harbor, desperately trying to board the few remaining ships, some of which, overloaded with refugees, sank in the bay. The last stand was made by the Knights Templar. They retreated to their massive, seafront fortress at the edge of the city, a great fortified compound that was a city within the city. For 10 more days, they held out, refusing all offers of surrender. Finally, the Mamluk sappers succeeded in undermining the foundations of their great tower. As the tower collapsed, it brought down not only the last of its heroic defenders, but also the Mamluk soldiers who were storming it, a final, defiant act of mutual destruction. With the fall of Acre, the dream of a Christian kingdom in the Holy Land was over. The remaining coastal cities surrendered without a fight. The great castles were abandoned. The last of the Franks, the descendants of the First Crusaders, sailed away, leaving behind them 2 centuries of history. The great and terrible story of the Crusades, which had begun with a sermon on a field in France and a cry of "God wills it," had ended in the blood and the fire and the dust of this last, fallen stronghold. Imagine the scene. The year is 1291. The magnificent port city of Acre, the last great bastion of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, is a smoldering ruin. From the harbor, the last of the Christian ships, crowded with the few fortunate survivors, weighs anchor and sets its sails for the west. They are leaving behind them not just a fallen city, but an entire world. For nearly 200 years, their ancestors had fought and died to build and defend this kingdom beyond the sea, this Outremer. Now, it was gone. As the ships disappear over the horizon, a profound silence settles over the coast of the Holy Land, a silence that marks the end of an era. The great and terrible story of the Crusades, which had begun with a thunderous cry of "God wills it," on a cold field in France, had ended in the quiet whisper of defeat on the shores of the Levant. What, then, was the legacy of this extraordinary and violent movement that had consumed the energies of Europe for so long? In purely military terms, the Crusades must be judged as a failure. Their primary, stated objective, to secure permanent Christian control over the holy city of Jerusalem, was not achieved. The initial, stunning success of the First Crusade proved to be an anomaly, a victory won against a divided and unprepared enemy, a victory that could never be definitively repeated. The subsequent major expeditions were, for the most part, a series of costly and often humiliating failures. They demonstrated the immense logistical challenges of moving large armies across vast distances, the fatal consequences of divided leadership, and the inherent difficulty of maintaining a foreign kingdom surrounded by hostile powers. Yet, the impact of the Crusades on the art of warfare itself was profound. The experience of fighting in the East led to significant developments in European military architecture. The great, concentric castles built by the Crusaders in the Holy Land, like the magnificent Croix de Chevaliers, with their multiple lines of defense, their projecting towers, and their sophisticated gatehouses, were far more advanced than anything that existed in Europe at the time. The knights who returned from the East brought these new architectural ideas with them, forever changing the design of castles in their homelands. The great military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, which were born out of the necessity of defending the Holy Land, became the first truly professional, permanent standing armies in medieval Europe, their discipline and organization becoming a model for future military structures. Politically, the Crusades reshaped both the East and the West. In Europe, they often had the unintended consequence of strengthening the power of monarchs. Kings were able to levy new taxes, like the Saladin tithe, to finance the expeditions, and they were able to expand their own authority while many of their most powerful and troublesome nobles were away on crusade, many of whom never returned. The papacy, which had initiated the movement, saw its prestige and power reach unprecedented heights, as it demonstrated its ability to mobilize the entire military might of Christendom. In the Middle East, the impact was equally profound. The arrival of the First Crusade had been possible only because the Islamic world was politically fragmented. But the presence of a common Christian enemy on their soil eventually spurred a powerful movement towards Muslim unity, first under the leadership of men like Zengi and Nur ad-Din, and culminating in the great, unified Ayyubid Empire of Saladin. The final victory over the Crusaders would fall to the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, a powerful military state whose very identity was forged in the crucible of the Holy War against the Franks. And the greatest and most tragic political consequence of all was the mortal wound inflicted upon the Christian Byzantine Empire. The betrayal of the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople in 1204, fatally weakened the great Eastern Christian Empire, leaving it vulnerable to the rising power of the Ottoman Turks, who would, 2 centuries later, finally conquer the city, a direct and ironic consequence of a Christian holy war. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusades was economic. They were not just religious pilgrimages, they were massive commercial enterprises. The great Italian maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew immensely wealthy by providing the ships and the loans needed to transport the vast Crusader armies. They established lucrative trading posts in the newly conquered Crusader cities, creating a new and powerful network of commerce that funneled the exotic goods of the East, spices, silks, sugar, and precious gems, into the markets of Europe. This new trade stimulated the European economy, contributed to the rise of a wealthy merchant class, and began to slowly break down the old, static feudal order. And with the flow of goods came a flow of ideas. The Crusaders who traveled to the east were exposed to a civilization that was, in many ways, far more sophisticated than their own. They encountered the advanced science, medicine, and philosophy of the Islamic world, much of which had been preserved from the classical Greek texts that had been lost to the West. This cultural exchange, though often occurring in the midst of conflict, reintroduced long-lost knowledge to Europe and helped to spark the intellectual ferment that would eventually lead to the Renaissance. But there was also a darker legacy. The Crusades created a deep and lasting chasm of bitterness and mistrust between the Christian and Islamic worlds. The brutal violence of the conquests and the rhetoric of holy war left behind a legacy of religious intolerance that would poison relations for centuries to come. And the rift between Western and Eastern Christianity, which had begun with the Great Schism of 1054, was made permanent and irreparable by the tragic sack of Constantinople. And so, as you drift now into the deepest and most peaceful realms of sleep, let the great, epic story of the Crusades find its rest. The cries of Deus Vult have faded. The great armies are gone. The heroes, both Christian and Muslim, now sleep beneath the sands of time. The castles they built have crumbled to ruins, and the kingdoms they fought for are nothing but a memory. What remains is a quiet echo, a long and complex story of how faith, ambition, greed, courage, and cruelty all mingled together to shape our world in ways we are still struggling to understand. The great story is over. And now, it is time for you to rest.